So we're really excited, Paul and I and the whole team, to be able to have Ajamu here. Many people listening obviously may know Ajamu. He's lived in Atlanta for many years, former director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, commentator, writer, speaker, has traveled extensively, has spoken at different forums and conferences and conventions and congresses of people of varying walks of life, all who are concerned about the issue of human rights, the end of war and poverty and racism. So I want to welcome Ajamu to the studio. He's been here many times before, but we haven't seen you in a while.
Yes, well, thank you. I mean, like I was saying earlier, I feel like I'm back home, so it's a pleasure to be here, and really a pleasure to be on this particular show because of the experiences that both of you have and the kind of fantastic cutting-edge information that you always bring to your listeners.
Well, we'll take that compliment, won't we? Thank you. Thank you, John. All right, so let's get to the heart of well, there's so many things we could talk about, but we have just had this history piece on the Trail of Tears of the Choctaw. We made reference to Standing Rock. There's an action here in Atlanta, a solidarity action with Standing Rock this Friday. There have been several others since this whole struggle began many months ago, and you were there. So let's talk a little bit about your impressions of, or your conclusions or your opinions about the significance of what it is that's happening in the plains of North Dakota, where with what started to be a relatively small group of members of the Standing Rock Reservation, a group of people that have endured many of the same kinds of violations of human rights that was described in the history piece, from theft of land, all kinds of racism, all kinds of poverty, just all kinds of indignities, a denial of their self-determination rights, launched a fight against a very well-funded pipeline that's going to bring fracked oil down through 4 states. And they started a struggle saying that they did not want that pipeline to potentially pollute the water that they use and drink, and moreover, but to go through their sacred sites, their burial sites, that it was a violation of their human rights. And it has now become an international issue, with the UN coming there, with all kinds of people from around the world coming in solidarity. So could you talk a little bit about how you felt when you were there?
Well, I think that the historical piece that you share with your listeners and the conversation around Standing Rock, I think they provide the kind of link that people need to make, that what we have with the Standing Rock struggle is a continuation of the struggle of indigenous people, reflected in that historical piece where, in essence, they were excluded, expelled from their historical territories because they were the victims of this expanding settler colonial state. And so that struggle for self-determination, for dignity, for sovereignty, continues. So the forms have changed over time, but it's been one continuous struggle. So what we have in Standing Rock is a reflection of the contemporary expression. That's what we have in Standing Rock is the attempt on the part of indigenous people to protect not only their sacred burial grounds, but their claim that all of that land, in fact, is their land, and that their protection of and rejection of this Dakota pipeline is something that's important not only for themselves but also for people who may be impacted downstream as a consequence of the threat to the water source. So, what we have to think about is that while there's a intersection between their concern about the source of water because they argue that the water source there in the Missouri River will impact them directly, but also impact 17 million people downstream. We have that environmental connection between that struggle and the rest of us who are concerned about the environment. But what they also want to emphasize is that that struggle is not just about the environment per se, but it's about this ongoing struggle. This ongoing struggle for them to assert their human right to exist, to reject the encroachment on their territories. So that has to be the basis of solidarity, and that was really the basis of why I ended up in Stand Your Rock. That it was there to stand in solidarity with that part of the struggle. And what I witnessed was something very, very important and very historically significant, because as they said themselves, this was one of the first times that they have seen the kind of unity among indigenous people, and some say over 100 years, that this struggle has galvanized so many of the indigenous nations. And regardless of what happens as a consequence of the struggle, it appears that their ability to be able to resist the U.S. colonial state is going to be significantly strengthened as a consequence of this particular war that's being waged.
Could you say a little more about, and I know that some of the language we're talking about here is recognized internationally through organizations like the UN, but the concept of the right of self-determination, which many oppressed people around the world, including people in this country, use as a slogan?
Well, it is a internationally recognized right, a collective right, if you will, and is reflected in various United Nations treaties, human rights treaties, in particular two very important covenants, the Economic Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Economic Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The first provision, as a matter of fact, that proclaims the collective right to self-determination on the part of peoples and nations. And it's been reflected in the concept reflected in the 1960 UN Declaration that proclaimed that peoples had a right to struggle against colonialism. It's reflected also in the treaty that was enacted in 2007, that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It was then again sort of proclaimed that there's a right to self-determination, not only for people who are nation states, but also for peoples, and specifically for indigenous people. So this is a recognized human right, and something that the U.S. Pretended to respect, and that means that they have certain obligations when they say they're going to respect the sovereign rights of indigenous people who are now trapped within the U.S. state. But we've seen over and over again that they have not lived up to their obligations to respect the right of sovereignty and self-determination.
So I wanted to ask again, one of the things that we have also seen, and kind of one of the main things that the Black Lives Matter movement has talked about is the militarized police forces. And that you will have not seen much of this coverage on any of the big business press. But if you are able to go and look on the internet, you will see lots and lots and lots of videos of tanks, of the use of pepper spray and tear gas, of police in full riot gear, up against people for the most part who, when they are praying or just standing, trying to prevent the construction of this pipeline, which if you again watch a video, it isn't this enormous gash through the land, just destroying everything in its path, whether it's just grassland or whether it's a burial site. So, Ajamu, could you talk a little bit about that relationship of this really a national kind of discussion that's taking place now about how police police?
Yeah, no, we see the evidence once again there in Standing Rock of a very aggressive response from the authorities, using the latest technology for how you control people. The other day we saw that they were using not only the traditional, what has now become traditional methods, using bean bags and rubber bullets, but also sound bombs. And then to supplement that, they use pepper spray and everything else. And again, dogs. So it's been a very aggressive response. We're seeing that kind of response really across the country. And the fact that it has not really outraged more people in this country, I think is reflective of the fact that people in this country have gotten slowly conditioned to accept that. I mean, when you have the so-called terrorist attack in Boston, you have this one wounded 19-year-old, and they shut down the entire city. They tell people to quote-unquote shelter in place, which means basically they impose a form of martial law, and people in fact did that. And then when they finally caught the young man, people came out and praised the authorities for basically declaring martial law in their cities. And people around the U.S. thought that was perfectly fine. And the same thing with the reactions from the rebellions in places like Ferguson and in particular in Baltimore. When people resisted the systematic war being waged on black folks, there was an initial condemnation of the resistors in Ferguson. That gradually began to change somewhat, but people were condemned, especially when they engaged in resistance that did not correspond to the proper forms. And what we saw in Baltimore, though, was even more significant. In fact, President Obama and most of the black leadership class condemned the resistors in Baltimore because they were not only resisting, but they were resisting against a black Democrat-led authority. And so we saw that as soon as there is this kind of resistance, the first thing that they do is they bring in the National Guard. I mean, in situations that don't seem to be justified. And we saw the same thing happen in places like Louisiana when the police forces found themselves under attack. It was this quick trigger, if you will, to bring in these even more militarized forces and no outcry from the public. So what we see is a dangerous situation being established. When they shut down Occupy across the country in this coordinated, systematic way, you would think that people would have been outraged, but again, they have accepted that. So what we have is this acceptance of this kind of authoritarianism, and you can't put this at the feet of the Republican Party. This is something that is being accepted as part of the culture, and both Republicans and Democrats not only accept this, but also push it, because you had Democrat operatives who were making decisions to bring in the National Guard. So this is a bipartisan
Repression.
Bipartisan repression, bipartisan conditioning for people in this country to accept systematic state repression without resistance.
Can you expand this a little bit? I saw a piece that you wrote that talked about the inconsistency that people should not be surprised to see what you're describing here domestically when we observe what's happening with our foreign policy.
Exactly. You can't be concerned about state violence in the U.S. and not connect that to state violence globally being perpetuated by the state is a moral and political contradiction. And in fact, what we're seeing in this country in a more dramatic way is the kinds of policies and practices that have been imposed on people outside the U.S. for decades, now being brought back home, if you will, quote unquote. Now, those of us in the black community we've always been subjected to those kinds of conditions and those kinds of practices. But with modern communication technology, now that's becoming more obvious to people outside the black community. And we're seeing that other communities are also now being subjected to these kind of heavy-handed, repressive operations. So, we have this culture of violence. We have this acceptance of militarism that is now having a impact domestically. You can't be concerned about violence in the U.S. You can't be concerned about things like the proliferation of guns in the U.S. and then not say anything about the fact that the #1 exporter of guns and weapons is the United States of America. So these things have to be connected, especially those of us who are trying to organize real opposition here in this country. We've got to penetrate the propaganda. We've got to help people to develop the kind of critical consciousness they need to have in order to resist being so easily manipulated by the state and by the state propagandists.
And that's a good reason for everyone to call or to go online and make a contribution to WRFG 89.3 FM because of the kinds of conversations that we can have here that you cannot get through a form of media that is owned by a big business, because so many of the major outlets for communication and media are controlled by actually the war profiteers.
Exactly.
So I do want to remind you that to call 404-523-8989 or go online at WRFG.org. And we will now continue our conversation with Ajamu. I wanted to ask a little bit about this connection. It has long been this blind spot, and I would say it sort of seems as though people feel as though they either can only fight on what we'll call a domestic issue, or they can be an anti-war activist. But somehow the fact that, just what you said, that they are absolutely connected, that it is impossible to disregard racism and oppression at home and at the same time be talking about opposing U.S. foreign policy and vice versa. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we have this U.S. centrism that has really emerged in the last couple of decades that impacts even progressive folks, that their focus tends to be just on the U.S. And as a consequence, the kind of anti-war and anti-imperialism that used to characterize left politics in the U.S. Has really diminished to the point that we even have significant elements of the left finding themselves or elected to be on the same side with U.S. imperialism in various parts of the world. And so that's something that's really problematic, very troubling, because what that means is that when you find yourself on the same side with the U.S. state, because of whatever way you rationalize that, because this state leader or that state leader, is a so-called dictator or whatever, you in fact are basically complicit with U.S. imperialism, because the very fact of the matter is, whatever internal contradictions may be in that particular state, the fact that the U.S. is opposed to that state and that system should raise some questions. I mean, because you ask a very simple question: when has the U.S. ever been on the side of the people? I mean, to me,
Really?
it's elementary.
Not
Really?
not a superficial,
Yeah.
propagandistic thing, but
So,
really.
so if you find that the U.S. Will identify X, Y, Z, or whoever as an enemy, then you have to wonder why you would also side with the U.S. against that so-called enemy. That you have to be suspicious of that. So it's a very strange phenomenon, but it's something that we see not only in the U.S. but really across Western Europe. So those kind of critical connections have to be made, because those of us who still stand up for international solidarity, who connect up with struggling people around the world, we're finding ourselves more and more isolated here in the U.S.
Could you, we got plenty of case studies we can look at. in terms of U.S. foreign policy, but can you talk about Haiti, Colombia, Syria, anywhere you want to go in the world?
Well, you know, what we see is, I mean, you're right, we can go almost any place in the world and see these kinds of contradictions, but I think some of the most obvious ones that we could talk about has been over the last 15 years, and the so-called war on terror, and the veritable rampage the U.S. has been involved in the so-called Middle East since 2001. We have this attack in New York, and the U.S. engages in this retaliation and creates the so-called war on terror that is basically a cover for being able to use military force to, in fact, engage in this colonialist adventure in the Middle East. And they invade and attempt to occupy Iraq, invade and put in place warlords in Afghanistan, expand their drone warfare across the so-called Middle East, unleash their intelligence agencies to engage in all kinds of subversion and assassinations. And what we see is, since 2001, something like 2 million innocent people have lost their lives as a consequence of this so-called war on terror. And this attempt by the U.S. to reshape the world. Because not only do you have, the longest standing war now in Afghanistan, you have Iraq that was destroyed, and now in the process of being reinvaded, not only by the U.S., now you got you got Turkey now involved in an illegal intervention into Iraq. They have no legal justification, no legal right to be in Iraq. You have Syria that's now been almost destroyed, dismembered as a consequence of deliberate U.S. policies. We know what happened in Libya, with the U.S. intervening to save lives, but in the process they ended up being responsible for killing something like 50,000 people. And the state of Libya being destroyed, and with the proliferation of weapons that went from Libya across North Africa, they helped to destabilize a number of other states, including Mali, and in particular Nigeria, with the military enhancement of Boko Haram. And so we see that, this is what the U.S. has been involved in. And they've been involved in this activity without any opposition, because people are not making those connections. So when people pretend like, Black Lives Matter in the U.S., that's a bunch of BS. Because if Black lives if that really was the case, then they would call out someone like Hillary Clinton for her hypocrisy. Because, she says Black Lives Matter to her, while she is bombing and killing Black and brown lives around the world. So we can't allow these kinds of contradictions to stand unopposed. We've got to make those kinds of connections. And what we have right now, something very, very dangerous. I'm going to go back to Syria for a moment. Hillary Clinton is talking about trying to establish or impose a no-fly zone in northern Syria, which means that basically that's a declaration of war. It means you have to knock out the Syrian anti-aircraft batteries and their radar. But not only do you have to knock out their facilities, you have to knock out the facilities of the Russians, who not only have their facilities on the ground, they are actively patrolling the airspace in northern Syria. So you're talking about the possibility of a confrontation between the U.S., a nuclear power, and the Russians, a nuclear power. So this is a very reckless kind of rhetoric. We don't think she's that crazy. We think it's just campaign talk, but it shows how cynical they are, that they would risk escalating tension like that with the Russians in order to, paint Donald Trump as some kind of, Putin stooge, and herself as the macho, if you will, person standing up to Putin. I mean, it's really absolutely incredible that they will stoop to that level to try to advance their campaign objectives. But it's very dangerous for the rest of the world also.
I want to go, we mentioned Haiti and Colombia, and there's just a few minutes left of the program, about 10. and again, this is a conversation that is encompassing of literally every single issue that anybody could be concerned about. So we haven't talked about all the issues of women and LGBTQ, and we haven't talked about labor unions under attack, and we haven't, there's just all kinds of things we haven't talked about, because of the picture has to include all of the forms of oppression, exploitation, racism, discrimination that exist in order, in my opinion, to actually put together the force, the movement, the people's struggle that actually can alter it all. Because if we just have a little change, suppose we make, we reported on 2 significant union victories today. Terrific. But in other words, nevertheless, every one of these other issues impact those workers. They won something with a contract, they won some wages, they won some guarantees on their job. But their life, the ability of them to live a fulfilling life, is imperiled by all these other issues. So could you talk, we haven't really talked much about Latin and Central America. If you live for a while in Colombia, so let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, in making those connections, you're absolutely right, that even those victories you talked about, people still have to deal with the fact that they have escalating housing costs. Many of them still have issues around health care. They live in communities where they are closing schools or consolidating classrooms. Or they may live in a community that is being polluted by some toxic waste dump. So these things are all connected, and you connect up those kinds of concerns in those areas with the ongoing struggles of people throughout the world, and in particular in Latin America. And we see, that we have common concerns and common enemies. You look at what's happening, and I'm glad you raised that question, because we want to talk about Haiti, we want to talk about Honduras, we want to talk about what's unfolding in Colombia. But Honduras is a case we need to raise up because we know that we have an election. We know that there are people who are running for office and they are pretending to be champions of human rights, but we know that they aren't, and they have a history to demonstrate that. We know that we had this influx of refugees from Honduras, but that didn't happen. It didn't just happen in thin air. We have a situation in Honduras where people, have been subjected to mass state repression as a consequence of a coup that was given a green light by U.S. authorities that created horrendous conditions for activists who ended up many of them having to either flee or try to get their families out. Just a few days ago, I shared the stage with the elder daughter of Berta Casares, who was assassinated in Honduras. And she's here to educate people in this country around their responsibility to oppose U.S. policies in their country. Haiti, same situation. We have an occupation, a UN occupation, that's really carrying out the interests of the U.S., where they are transforming Haiti into basically a gigantic sweatshop. And you're talking about the interests of workers. I mean, they basically want Haitians to be enslaved. Even the backward government in Haiti passed a law to increase the wages up to 63 cents an hour. But Hillary Clinton and the U.S. intervened and got them to cut that back in half again. So they ended up going back to 33 cents. I think they compromised around 40 cents an hour because they claimed that would make Haiti less attractive for foreign investment. So these are the kind of things that are happening. The champions of human rights in the U.S. are in fact advancing. And we have a situation in Colombia. We don't have time to really get into that full history. We've talked about it before. An ongoing fight, ongoing guerrilla struggle, with the assistance of the U.S. with the Colombian government, and the peace process finally that was negotiated after a number of years, taken to the people in the form of a referendum. But there were elements inside of Colombia, some of them still aligned with some powerful elements in the U.S. That didn't want to see an end to the conflict. and they propagated their backward positions among the Colombian population, and a fraction of, a little bit over half, agreed with them, and they voted down the peace accord. So now they're trying to figure out how to salvage that, because, you know, the folks who voted it down were people in parts of Colombia that weren't directly impacted, at least for the last decade or two, from the war. But the folks who really wanted to see peace were those people who are directly impacted, you know, along the Pacific coast and other parts of Colombia, black folks and others. So, you know, we have a situation that's really dire, and people in this country have to be made aware of the role of their state, because no one can be innocent. Innocence is a luxury. Innocence is a moral contradiction when your state is involved in this kind of criminality.
I want to, we just have a few minutes left. If you could address the issue of the role of labor unions in particular. One of the things that was very interesting about Standing Rock was that the AFL-CIO came out in a position, you know, supporting the pipeline, talking about jobs. But a number of the individual members of the AFL-CIO, the CWA, the ATU, the Nurses United, a number of unions, came out in support of the struggle at Standing Rock, supported self-determination, supported the environment, and said that issues of working people and this struggle were linked. So could you talk a little bit about whether you see a shift, because I found that, you know, the fact that there were unions that came out in contradiction to the AFL, to be a most encouraging sign.
I did too. I mean, that was very that was a very good development. But it's still disheartening that we have major unions that can't really see beyond their own narrow interests, and have not done the kind of work they need to do internally to shift consciousness, to have people have a better understanding of the issue of colonialism, to deal with the issue of race and racism. And so you look up and you have these kinds of struggles, and you have unions on one side and popular struggles on the other. And you know, that has been a real detriment to building the kind of progressive social bloc that we need to build here in this country if we're going to be able to defeat the concentrated power of capital. But we have all of these contradictions, and they're not psychological contradictions either. They're also material contradictions. So you have people who are concerned about jobs and making a good wage to work for that company that's building the pipeline, you know, and then being pitted against other working people, because, you know, indigenous folks also work, who are also trying to protect their territories. And so, you know, we've got to figure out how we can build unity to the extent that we can. And so I think unions have a real important role to play in that, but they've got to, you know, we've got to have, and I'm glad that a lot of the younger workers are the ones who are standing with the people in Standing Rock, because I think it portends what we have coming in the future, that basically we're going to be able to overthrow some of these more reactionary leaders and begin to build the kind of union movement we have to build in this country in order to have labor play the kind of leadership role that it should in fact be playing.
Well, with only a minute or so, to come full circle on this statement by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz about indigenous peoples offer possibilities for life after empire. What is your sense of life after empire in just a minute or two?
Well, but what she's referring to is something very important that's happening throughout the Americas, and that even just with indigenous people, but also with African people, that they are developing new ways of living. They are they are remembering how to live with nature. They are developing new ways of economic development that does not put them in contradiction with Mother Earth, and new ways of of relating to one another. So there's some very innovative things being dealt with outside of the U.S. They are the ones that are providing the kind of models we have to really look at to take this struggle forward and transcend the now.